so it's 12:30. We're going to get a start. I will say I'm new to this technology, so please don't fry me if things don't work exactly the way they're supposed to. We set up 2 poll questions to get us started today. So I have launched the first question. Kitty, can you help me? Do you see the question?
I do not see it. I was just going to tell you that. I don't see it.
Okay, I'm going to launch polling, see. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, so for those of you that are watching, you'll see the question 1. I consistently no-till some fields on my farm every year. And you can answer yes or no. If you take your cursor and you put it right into one of those boxes, yes or no, and click on it, that will answer that question. And then what crops do you plant without tillage? And you have a series of crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa. Can you click in each one of those that you have planted without tillage, please? And we're going to give you a little bit of time to do this. We got responses from about half of you at this point. We'll give you a couple more minutes to answer. So I think most people have had a chance to answer.
This is great information, Jeff, because I wouldn't necessarily have predicted that distribution among the crops. Very interesting.
Yeah, so I'm going to show you what the results are now, I hope. So on your screen are the results. So over half of you responded. And so first question, I consistently no-till some fields on my farm every year. And yes, we're over 50%. We're at 60%. What crops do you plant without tillage? 27% corn, 33% soybeans, 20% wheat, 20% alfalfa. And I think what Kitty's alluding to is she's looking at that alfalfa and probably scratching her head a little bit. I will say that some folks in our county do all their rock picking and leveling of fields in their soybean production year, and then they follow that with alfalfa, and because they've done all that work ahead of time, they can no-till their alfalfa in. So that's probably why you're seeing that result, Kitty.
Yeah, and I see a comment in the chat box too, Jeff, that a couple of folks could just pick one crop. It wouldn't let them pick multiple, so that could contribute to the answer.
Okay, and here you go. Jeff is not up on his technology. And so at least we have an idea. We definitely have an idea that some of you folks definitely no-till some fields. And I know farmers in this area started off by no-tilling corn into their previous soybean fields because it was so mellow and so easy to do so without having to do any tillage. And I suspect that a lot of you may have that practice on your farm as well. So I'm going to stop sharing the results. And I'm going to thank Jeff, Joe, boy, I can't even say his name, Assimile. Correct me if I'm wrong, Janice. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Amsily.
Okay. So Joe is an individual at Cornell that's done a lot of work in soil health, and he interviewed the person that we're going to introduce right now, which is David Dumm. And David is from Binkley and Hurst, which is a dealership that has 5 locations from as far south as Maryland and as far north as Delaware. And he's their planter specialist. And that's what we're going to show you today is a recording of his discussion of no-till planters. And then we hope to have some good discussion at the end of that. So with that, I'm going to share my screen again.
NRCS, Soil Water Conservation District.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning. We're going to, as my title says, making the most of your planning experience without breaking the bank. And I guess one of the things that I like to highlight is some of it's the small details that aren't, necessarily buying a brand new planter to do it, but it's what we're using to make the best job of what we have. So we'll get started here. And as I said, it doesn't really matter whether you're planting into heavy cover crop or into, stubble or work ground. It's how well we're going to do to get that seed placed in the ground. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, and some of the things to look out for on your planter, some of the newer technologies that are coming, some of the things that do affect yield, and things to be pay attention to. So when we think about what our planter's doing, we got 3 jobs that planter's doing. We want to have even seed depth. We want to have good seed to soil contact and proper closing of the seed trench. So these are 3 important things that we're doing with that planter. We don't do a good job with these 3. We're going to see issues with yield, stand, and all. So we'll talk about how some of these relate to the planter. So when we start talking about peak performance of the planter, the one that I want to highlight and we'll talk some about through here is proper maintenance of planters, choosing the proper attachments. And I think sometimes the one that's really missed more than anything is adjustment of the field and the planter, taking the time behind the planter and making sure that it's doing the job that we are expecting. So what type of things can affect yield? Of course, the population. Are we putting the right population for our soil conditions, moisture? I mean, weather is one that we can't always control. Some areas, yes, they do irrigate and all, so we can control some of our moisture and fertility of the soil. So, these are things that, we need to consider when we're going out to plant, population, what can our soil moisture in the fields that we're going to be in, and fertility support. And so we aren't going to touch much more on that. I'm a machinery man, not an agronomist per se, but I just want to hit a few things here. One of the things we talk about ear count and yield. So on the whole, 1 ear is equal to roughly 7 bushel per acre. So if you do a stand count at on a thousandth of an acre and count the viable ears, roughly you're 7 bushel, depending on the little on the side of the ear and all. So it gives you a little thought process to go look at what an ear does. And so what happens if we don't have good ears or don't put on ears? Couple things to think about. We set the yield at up to about V8. We're setting the yield V8. The yield is set. All we can do after that point is take yield away because of weather conditions or insect damage or lack of fertility at that point. So the early stages of that plant growth is so important. I mean, the yield in the bag is great, but everything we can do from there on reduces yield. So it's very important that when we start thinking about yield potential, what we do in that early stages of the plant growth. So, and in about V4, the plant is actually setting the number of rows in the plant. So, as I said, again, very early, some of the plant is setting some of what's going to happen down the road. So we don't do a good job early. we can stress it down the road. You know, some of this is showing, you know, what happens later if we run out of moisture or run out of some other conditions. But when we think about it, the year itself is set right to start with, very early, what it's going to do. So we can start looking at a skip in 1/1000th of an acre. We're going to look at about 5.7 bushel loss for having a skip. So if we're seeing skips, and I always tell guys being out, I like to look at a field early because a skip isn't necessarily, I'm a machinery fellow, so I get blamed because we got skips in the field. I like to dig very often. The planter's done it, sometimes it's done its job, put a seed there, but for some reason that seed is not viable. Either it's part of the non-germination seed that's in the bag, or did it get insect damage? Did it not get placed properly in the seed trench? So those are things we'll talk a little bit as we go through here. A double, if you're starting to see doubles, they're going to say you get about 2.8 bushel loss. Some of that's just because you're overplanted, the plants are being stressed. But the one that, and spacing, you know, it can, you know, seeds closer than 4 inches, we'll see some amount of ear reduction size. Again, that's a double, so you get 2 ears that probably have reduced size when you get them close together. So like they show here, ear 83 was 2.5 inches from ear 84. So it's showing stress from being too close to the neighbor. And if you look at 84, you can see it truncated the tip a little bit because it was being stressed. So we do want it good inline. But the one thing that sort of struck me recently, and some of the things we've done, is what affects ear count. And of course, we're talking ear count. In other words, what viable ears do we put on? So emergence has become a very critical thing that I look at more. So if the plant itself looks to be within 24 to 34 hours, 48 hours, 48 hours, those plants all ought to be out of the ground together. If we get outside that window, they start looking at being a weed to each other and they become in competition. The roots are competing. So if you have plants that are late emergers, those are going to be the ones. So if we look at a plant that's 32 to 48 hours later coming up than its neighbors, we're going to say we get about 5/10 of a loss on that ear. If we get to an L2, which is more than 48 hours, we're going to see a total loss on that ear. That plant probably is not going to put a viable ear on. So it's so important, and I think to go scout fields and see how even is that coming up. In other words, within that first 24 hours, we should see our final population. We shouldn't be waiting a week or so to see our final population. We're dropping yield by doing that. Some of the things that we've looked at, as I said, being a planter guy, I get guys hit me up for, you know, my planter didn't do the job, I got skips, and then I go digging and find seed. And I think a couple things to understand with seed, there are different types of germination tests. And the warm germ test is what you normally see on the bag. They put it in a warm medium at 77 degrees for 6 days and count the germination. You know, that should give you 93% or better. And then there's a cold germ test where they put it in a moist medium, 50 degrees for 7 days, and then 73 degrees for 5 days. So that's 85% or better. And then so what happens is if you are planting in cold conditions, this is sort of a mean days to germination by soil, you know, soil temperature. If you start looking and you start getting in that 50-degree soil and colder, you look at the number of days to you germinate. So the longer that seed sits in the ground and doesn't germinate, we are going to see seed that becomes non-viable, not going to put you know, maybe even come up out of the ground. I've seen this quite often. You know, And then, as I said, to do some germ tests, these cold germ or cold saturated germ tests, we can see a lot of variation in what a seed will be able to handle and come up in adverse conditions. It doesn't mean that seed with poor cold germ tests can't be used. It just needs to be a management tool, not to plant it before a cold rain or in cold, wet soil, because it's not going to do well. Had a customer a couple years ago come in, and he had a 16-row planter and split it 8 and 8. Had a field that he knew lay a little wet. They were calling for rain, and so he went in and planted it, thought he would get in and get it planted before it rained, because he knew if he didn't, it'd be a few weeks maybe to get back in and plant it, be late planted then. And he said, I never saw anything like it. He said the 8 rows of the one hybrid just came up just fine, and the other one, he said, I hardly had a stand, maybe a 50% stand. I said, I'm gonna have to go back and replant it. Had to go borrow his old 8-row planter from a neighbor that had bought it from, go in and patch in the 8 rows. And he was like, I can't understand it. I planted it with the same planter the same day. And then we got talking about this cold germination and the strength of the seed. And it's an issue to look at. The seed companies don't always want to put it on their bag, but something that we're seeing more and more of. And I've seen that in fields too, that, you know, we start seeing skips. You know, you dig and you've got seed that's become unviable because it doesn't have a cold germ in adverse conditions. So something to look at, you know, when your seed, large lots, check, ask your seed guy, what's the cold germ on this lot? It can vary. So something to look at. So we look at what are our priorities of the planter pass. So really what we're doing is we're looking at ear count. That's what we're trying to do. We want to maximize our ear count. So we have emergence is the base of it. So if we don't do a good job with emergence, we're going to start, you know, that's the foundation our ear count's based on. Singulation, how well are we singulating the seed with the planter? Spacing is not one of the major ones. And population, yes, you know, that's one that we control real easy how we set. But when you think about it, it's all based on emergence. So if we don't have good even emergence, some of the rest of our pyramid is going to be on shaky foundation. So things that we want to pay attention to with emergence is depth of seeding, tillage practices, temperature of soil moisture, and the soil moisture. So, you know, are we planting into moisture? Do we have adequate soil temperature? I was out this spring with some of the new technology with a smart firmer on, and we were getting a planter started, and I was sort of shocked that day that I didn't see a soil temperature read on that smart sensor above 40 degrees. And I'm like, man, I sure wouldn't be planting a lot of corn at 40 degrees soil temperature. But I was sort of glad that we got a planter started that day, but it wouldn't be one that I would want to put my hammer down and keep planting in those conditions, because I think we're going to see some issues depending on the variety. So I talk about some of the technology. I'll just hit, this is a smart firmer where we actually have a, in the back of that seed firmer with smart technology, and it has an infrared sensor in it, so we can do soil moisture with it. There's a temperature sensor in, so we get temperature. So again, you know, we can do some of that manually to go and look. Are we, you know, should we go a ½ inch deeper to get into soil moisture so we get that nice even germination? Are we consistently in the moisture? So, you know, as I said, we start talking about things to do. I like to start, you know, with down pressure. Do we have adequate down pressure on the row units? Are we maintaining our depth? I mean, depth is very important. And then, I mean, if we have to go 2 inches deep to get into moisture, we got to have enough of down pressure to put the planter in the ground. So we're going to, you know, it doesn't matter whether we got, you know, springs or airbags, are they adjusted for the conditions we're planting in? Do we have adequate down pressure? We're not don't have over pressure, more pressure than we need. Again, it's simple maintenance, or our springs are all there. We don't have broke springs. You know, can we adjust them? Some of them were, some of the older styles are much harder to adjust, probably never did get adjusted. When we're in that area too, we can look a little bit at the parallel arms and make sure that the parallel arms are in good shape. And, you know, we don't have a lot of slop in those arms. We get slop in the arms, that's going to affect our evenness of depth. Again, you know, we start with some of the newer technology. We start about pinch point rows, you know, between transport wheels and all. Probably might need a little more pressure on those rows than in the rows between them. And so that's something to be thinking about, you know, checking multiple rows. Do we have adequate down pressure across the board? Some might have to be changed a little different than another row. Of course, I said new technology coming, the hydraulic down pressure, where we're actually putting a weigh cell on the gauge wheels and adjusting on the go to a maintaining a set pressure on the gauge wheels versus, you know, trying to figure out what is adequate down pressure. So we're actually going row by row. Again, you know, do we take a look at gauge wheels? Gauge wheels affect our depth. The gauge wheel here on the left, you think about it, it's down in our area, we got rocks and we bend gauge wheels up. And so you think about that, that's no longer round. So what it's going to do to our depth as it goes round, it's going to keep changing our depth. We're not going to have consistent depth. So something that we need to pay attention to. Another thing with a planter, we'd like to have a little contact along this area with our gauge wheel. If we think about it, especially in work ground, if this thing is gapping, I can put my hand up between, we start what I call rooster tailing dry dirt into our seed trench. Well, do we really want dry dirt thrown around our seed? No, again, it's going to affect that good seed to soil contact with moisture, so we get that even germination. So that's another maintenance point. You know, do we need to replace gauge wheel arms, or do we need to just shim our gauge wheels here to maintain contact here so we don't get that dry dirt, surface dirt, getting rooster tailed with the gauge wheel into our seed trench. So another little thing to look at on a planter that we want to be careful with, that simple maintenance that can affect how well we place our seed in the ground. Been a lot of discussion over the last few years on Coulters and, you know, no Coulters, and a couple things that I do look at is, I mean, this was, I remember back in when they had AC first came out, they used a big wide Coulter, and we were trying to work ground up. I think it was, we couldn't figure we could no-till without having loose dirt to plant into, so we used a wide Coulter. It's not one that I would use today in front of a planter row unit. Throws more dirt at the speeds we're planting. Here's one, the bubble blade, great penetration in dry soil, but it can create issues in wetter soils that we will sort of glaze the sidewall, make a smooth sidewall, make roots very hard to get out of the seed trench. To me, that's a no-till Coulter blade only for drier conditions. It's not one for early spring planting when you can get a little wet, especially with some clay content in your soil. Your 13-way or your turbo blades are probably the ones that are being used more than anybody. One of the things that I caution is that that no-till Coulter blade shouldn't be running any deeper than the seed opener blade. We want the seed opener blade to be set in the bottom of the trench, not the Coulter blade, because we can't have consistency there. So those are some of the things to look at Coulters. Again, just, you know, basic maintenance. Are my bearings good? Are the diameters adequate to do the job? One of the areas that I do see very often is seed opener blades not being extremely worn. As I said, these pictures are pictures off of, quote, field-ready planters that got traded in, or planters that we did uptimes on. And, you know, a typical Deere Kinsey planter, the new blade is 15 inches new. You should be changing them out at about 14.5. Doesn't seem like a lot of wear, but when we start wearing too far, you know, we start exposing our seed tube guard, our seed tubes down here can get broke off. You know, this is going to hurt us. We aren't going to keep that nice true V. So those are maintenance things. They're wear items. When we go into no-till, we're going to see faster blade wear. I mean, but in the days when we used moldboard plows and chisel plows, we were changing shears and points quite readily. I mean, it's no different. We're doing some tillage work and working ground. Those are wear items that will need serviced. When we install new blades, a couple things. Anytime we will change blades, we will also change this frog or inner seed tube guard and keep it fresh, because it prevents the blades from going in and rubbing on the seed tube as you're going through the ground. On the opener blades, we want to set them in so that they are, we take a business card top and bottom. We're looking, especially now with when they're using these new heavier blades, we want about an inch to an inch and a half of contact. Older manuals would have said 2 to 3, but with the heavier blades, the blades don't flex, and we'll take out our bearings and hubs much quicker because there's too much preload on them if we shim them much heavier than that. Closing wheels, again, it is maintenance. What's going to work best in your conditions. We want to make sure that our seed trench is centered between the closing wheels, so we're doing the even from both sides. You know, if this thing is sloppy, your tail wheel brackets are sloppy and it's going back and forth, we can't do a nice job closing from both sides of the row. Again, you know, checking bearings, checking to make sure our, you know, we got rubber closing wheels, that the tires are off. As I said, there are, you know, I'll say there's 100 different closing wheels out there. They all work specifically better in some conditions than others. The other thing that I will caution is, on some of them, is you need to read the manufacturer's instructions on proper setup and installation so that they do the job that they're supposed to. The Martin spike, you know, we want 2 1/4 to 2.5 inches between the spikes at the bottom, or we'll start getting into the seed trench and moving dirt. As I said, there are so many closing wheels out there. I will tell some guys that, oh, I think I need a different closing wheel. Try a row or two. Don't always redo the whole planter with something till you try it on a row or two and see how it does compare. But again, making sure we follow the manufacturer's recommendations for spacing, and also make sure that bearings are all in good shape. Some new technology. This is some automatic control down pressure on the tail wheel brackets coming out. 2-stage, you know, looking at 2-stage, trying to close the trench from the bottom up and then tucking the top, finishing the top off. Some of the spike wheels, we will pull drag chains. And what's the idea of the drag chain? If you look at this, is no drag chain. You can sort of still see where on a spike closing wheel, you can sort of see where the trench was. You pull the drag chain, you just pull enough of loose dirt to close up any few last air pockets on the top. You know, that's one of the things that we want to see, that seed trench closed. A corn plant likes to be 1.5 inches, minimum 1.5 inches deep. And if it sees light before 1.5 inches, like an open seed trench, it's going to change some of the ear height set and all, because it thinks it's planted shallow. So we want to make sure we close that seed trench completely. Why do we use spike closing wheels, or why do we have some of these wheels? We're trying to break this sidewall compaction. You get the right conditions. I mean, you look at this sort of has a glaze to it. As I said, a bubble blade, or if it's wet conditions, we get a glaze here. So it makes it very tough for the soil roots to get out. So we're trying to mechanically break that sidewall up so that we give spots that roots can get out of the seed trench. So if you would dig plants up and see roots that look like this is an indication that we probably planted wet and had that glazing on the sidewall, and our roots especially our early roots, don't ever get outside that seed wall. So you think about how we were restricted later in the season, moisture availability of that plant, you know, going out and getting nutrients. Did see a little bit in a couple fields this spring. I was amazed to see, you know, I could see it. Somebody made the comment, they had the fertilizer guy out and checking something. He said, I never saw roots. When I dug up one plant, I pulled up the neighboring plant or so. Well, they were so intertangled because they got out in that seed trench, and that's where all the roots grew because they couldn't get out of the seed trench. So if you're seeing some of this, it is a good time to go and take a look at, you know, are we doing things that make our sidewall slick? We also talk about, you know, we're doing more cover crop, we're doing more, you know, no-till. The residue management actually starts in the fall. We want to make sure that we spread that residue over the whole combine width. I mean, if we're running a 30-foot head or 35-foot head, we need to be spreading that residue over the whole thing. Couple things, I mean, it is nutrients that's not being adequately, you know, evenly spread. I mean, you wouldn't want your dry fertilizer box to have an uneven spread pattern. You should take time to calibrate them and make sure you got an even spread pattern. Same thing goes with your combine and all, that you want to spread that residue over evenly over the whole width of the machine. As I said, it's a little hard to set up a planter to, especially if it doesn't match up with the header, that you actually are handling the residue right the whole way across the planter. We've seen much more input with no-till and cover crops that goes to trash sweeps. Again, it's a little bit like closing wheels. There's any number out there. One of the things I tell people, a trash sweep is not a tillage tool. It is supposed to brush the residue off the surface, but it's not supposed to make a deep gash. It's supposed to get the residue out. So 2 reasons: brush some of the residue off so that we get a little more warming of the soil, and also that we do not hairpin residue in with our culver or seed opener blades. And again, if we put residue into the seed trench and we put the seed in there, again, we've affected our seed to soil contact, and hence how quickly that will emerge versus neighbors that aren't that way. Well, one of the things that has come out more to help, you know, fine tune that as we change conditions across the field and all, is air cylinders or hydraulic down pressure on the sweeps, where we can pull pressure off sweeps and up and off and add depending on how we're trying to move residue in the field. The importance of sweeps, this was a sort of showing some things in a field day. We had a planter we had done with the Pennsylvania No-Till Alliance and the Extension Service down here in Pennsylvania. We had taken a trade planter in and left one row the way it got traded. We did the next row, we basically did an uptime but changed no equipment on it. And then the other 4 rows, we made some equipment changes to plant different conditions and residue. And they did numerous test plots. The picture on the right there was a field day, summer field day for crop consultants that we helped participate in. There's cover crop, and they had cover crop that had burned down over about a 4-week period. So we went through different areas, and this is what a sweep, you know, the sweep moved stuff away. We got a nice clean seed soil, you know, place to plant our seed in. We didn't hairpin. This was the row that was the way it was. End of the pointer is the seed. That seed never got in the seed trench. It was sitting on top, all wedged in with organic matter that was on the surface. It's not going to be a very good viable seed to germinate. It's, you know, maybe if we get rain late or something it will, but it's going to be uneven. I mean, this was a plot they had planted in the spring, sort of the same way, but so they had standing corn. You know, this was the row, you know, man, we got skips, and, you know, oh, got a planter. Well, the planter probably actually had the seed there, but it wasn't getting good seed to soil contact. row behind would have been the one of the rows that had been repaired, and probably actually one that had sweeps on. Very nice looking stand. So again, let's take a look. This was actually from the, if you remember the big hairy vetch, that hairy vetch was planter frame high plus, and this is your seed where they're actually placing the seed. You see it swept out, really didn't move any dirt, but nicely swept out and planting in there. So that's what we're looking at. We want to get that seed bed, you know, clean so we don't put stuff in. I mean, this stalk here is a late emerger, is a weed, taking moisture away from the good ones, fertility away from the good ones, and isn't going to put a viable ear on. So that's why we pay attention when we do sweeps. Again, as I said, we want to make sure that we do a sweep. We aren't trying to move a lot of dirt. We'd like to get the residue out of the way, but we're trying to prevent this when we get a hairpin or a one that's not getting that good seed to soil contact. We've had some emphasis on crop rollers. We had some guys doing it both ways, rolling it independent or on the planter. The ones I see on the planter is sort of can be a little higher maintenance. I have a little feeling sometimes rolling it outside, being on the planter, if something happens to this on the planter, you can put your whole planter down. The other one, you have a little rescue time to do things. So I think we're going to see more of it. I did talk about, you know, we'll talk a little bit fertilizer application, a couple things. You remember the roots that couldn't get out, the glazed sidewall. Single disc fertilizer openers will tend to glaze a sidewall pretty quick. So one of the things that, you know, I started to go back and look at some installation manuals and all, and early on, it always seemed like you put the opener blade between the drop point and the seed trench. And if that opener made a glazing on the sidewall, the roots can't get through that glazing to get to the fertilizer you put in the ground. So one of the things that we want to look at, and maybe you got to move fertilizer openers around a little bit, we want the fertilizer to be dropped between the fertilizer opener blade and the seed trench. We don't want this fertilizer drop point in the opposite side of the fertilizer blade. So something to take a look at. Again, not necessarily, it's a little time consuming maybe to move some openers around, but it's not a necessarily a big expense, but maybe will help you in the end with yield. Again, all sorts of ways to put fertilizer on between the seed drop and your closing in front of the row units. Again, many different ways. Again, numerous ways to put in-furrow fertilizer down, pop up in, and then we also have some, we're seeing more dribbling nitrogen out behind, put maybe a little stabilizer in the nitrogen, or a little starter on top of the ground, banded on top of the ground. Again, newer systems coming out. This is actually has a knife in between the split gauge wheel, so we are very consistent with our fertilizer spacing off the row. Another system to actually have 3 application points near in the seed trench and in the seed trench walls. Again, fertilizer systems can be very simple or they can be very complicated. I mean, there's no reason to, basically the ones pictured here are like a commercial self-propelled sprayer, you know, PWM controlled rates, so we can do variable rate and do section control on the planters. One of the things they do encourage guys with liquid to have some form of individual row monitoring and keep an eye. I mean, red balls are simple, unless you're doing black label or something, then you can't see the balls floating, but for nitrogen and most starter fertilizers, they do a nice quick reference point to know that we're getting, you know, keeping fairly even between rows. There's other ones that are more electronic that are available today. they all work very well. We're even getting technology that we can do that turn compensation, you know, flow meter with variable rate and turn compensation, so we can control fertilizer. Another one to look at is point row clutches. The savings on seed is part of it. The other part is, when you think about this, we've got twice the population here, so this is going to be areas that you're going to be overpopulated, so your moisture and soil fertility probably can't support it all. And the other thing that happens too here is, because it's overpopulated, those are areas that maybe you'll go down and give you more trouble. So point row clutches do a lot. I mean, in those, we're stressing the ears in those overpopulated areas compared to having healthy ears. So those are things. Point row clutches will pay for themselves. I used to figure about 500 acres and 3 years, I could pretty well pay back a clutch system just on seed savings alone on our odd-shaped fields of Pennsylvania. And some of your New York areas would be similar with the odd-shaped fields we have. And that didn't count for any yield bump in the overplanted areas that guys are saying. So those are some of the things. Lots of different meters out here today. The vacuum meters are taking over a little more, I think, over the finger. The finger is still good, but need maintenance and make sure the meters are all in working condition. We're seeing more and more come out with electric drives. And of course, the electric drive is doing clutching and doing variable rate. The one thing that electric drive, and most of the electric drives, they're doing turn compensation. So if you think you're going around a turn like this, what happens? The inside goes too fast, the outside goes too slow. So our population changes. So if you think about it, I mean, we're losing yield because we're underpopulated on the outside and we're overpopulated on the inside, so we're losing yields in two places. This was sort of showing that affect the inside row, the outside row. So that's one of the things that the electric drive is allowing us to do, is turn compensation around. Instead of having a planter-wide population, each row is doing it. So we're getting what we're looking for. Technology for higher speed to actually deliver the seed to the furrow is, there's about 4 vendors now doing that. The next technology probably we haven't hit real hard yet. It's multi-hybrid. Again, I talked about, different hybrids for germination. Well, do we have a hybrid that we want to put on our shale hill and something different that we want down in our flat of the field? And so are we going to start picking hybrids that have characteristics that work better in one soil condition or another within a field setting? So that's something that's coming in the industry, is looking at multi-hybrid units. So again, I'd like to go back and just sort of highlight this. What are the priorities of the planter pass? Of course, as I said, we're looking at the ear count pyramid. So the first one is emergence. So emergence is going to depend on good seed to soil contact, moisture in the furrow, and soil temperature. So those are things that we need to watch out for with our planter. If we don't get out and check, is the seed going where we really would like it? Do we need to make it a little deeper? Singulation, again, is making sure the meter's doing the job. We're not getting skips, we're not getting multiples. Spacing, again, speed. The typical speed tube, or the typical seed tube, was made, that curve in the seed tube was actually made for about 5 miles an hour to give zero velocity when a seed came out the bottom of the seed tube. So if you get much over 5 miles an hour, you will get some more seed roll in the seed trench, and your spacing can go. And then population, it's population that you set to do the job that you want. This was a picture that came out of an operator's manual probably at the turn of the century. It looks like a real modern corn planter there. To ensure good work and accurate planting, corn planters must be well oiled and all parts must be firmly in position. Parts must be replaced when badly worn or the efficiency of the planter is impaired. And I think, I mean, you could put that in today's current planter. I mean, we have all this technology on it, but if it's not in good working order and you know, properly maintained, it's not going to do any better job than this one did planting. So it's something to do. One of the things that I so much find at fault that we get in a hurry, we don't spend time checking behind the planter. I mean, that's digging seed, making adjustments on the planter as we change field conditions, you know, doing some depth measurements. Or is our depth where we want? Are we into that moisture band? Should we be a little deeper? You know, inch and 3/4 is a nice shooting depth, but maybe 2 1/4 is where the moisture is, and we'll get that good seed to soil contact. So we need to get behind the planter, dig in the furrow, find the seed. I have had people say, well, I have problems finding seed. Well, when I started here, I went out and started a planter planting carrots, and I'll tell you what, it's a boulder in the seed trench, a kernel of corn compared to a carrot seed. And the guy had a 9-row planter, and we did population and depth checks about 3 or 4 times on each of the 9 rows. So it takes a little patience, but if things are working right, you should be able to find that seed. Double check the population, you know, make sure that tire pressures are set beginning of the year. Do a little checking to make sure that your population, your monitors is doing the job you want. The thing that, you know, we're looking for at the end is we want a nice, what we call picket fence stand. And what you're looking for is you're looking for stalks that are even. You want stalks that are nicely spaced. You don't want to see thin stalks, light stalks, thin, you know, heavy stalks and thin stalks. You want the stalks to look sort of like mirrored copies of each other. It's just so important to go out, because to recover a poorly done planting job, you'll never recover. To replant is not always beneficial. Take time in the season to check behind the planter, check your fields as they start to emerge. You know, okay, I got skips. Is a good time to dig, and do I have a seed there where the skip is that's a late germ, or, you know, is it truly not a skip in the field? That sometimes is some of the biggest payback. Did have a customer a number of years ago call me and was upset because he said something's wrong with the planter, don't have a stand. You know, it was, and we went to visit the farmer, and I had corn that was knee high, had corn that was just spiking out the ground, you know, a leaf or two, and I had spaces that I didn't see anything, and got looking. I dug up the corn that was knee high and realized it was only planted about a ½ inch deep, and he just didn't realize that, you know, they hadn't checked the planter as they went through the field to see if they had the depth right, enough adequate down pressure to actually hold it at the depth they were at. And what I figured out is it was dry, got dry when they planted, and then they got rain. So where they had moisture, that's what came up early, and what was just spiking through was from a rain. And looking, there was seed on top of the ground. So that's how shallow it was. And it's, you know, tell a guy, probably your best to do is go in and take it out and replant it. It's not, you know, a little time with behind the planter. I know we get in a hurry in the spring, but to me, the one thing that I will say is the most important thing after you do your winter maintenance on the planter is make sure you take time as you change fields, change field conditions, to get behind that planter and make sure it's doing the job you want it to do. I think Joe said I can get it.
Okay, folks, that's the end of the video. We'd like to entertain some questions at this point. One question from Steve Durfee was, will the high-speed seed drop work in stony ground? And we do have some other folks on the line here today from Monroe Tractor. I don't know whether, Roy, you want to take that question or not?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so when you're planting in stony conditions, the biggest thing is the row unit bouncing throughout the field. And as you speed up, that row unit bounces even more. So the biggest thing would be adding hydraulic downforce to the row unit. That's where I would start. And that would help reduce the bounce. And then you can get into the speed tubes or the high-speed delivery of the seed. I think a no-till coulter in that situation would not benefit the performance.
Thanks, Roy. Other questions from
Jeff,
folks?
there's another question in the chat box. Oh, nope. I guess there isn't.
So we'll give you a couple of minutes to maybe think about what questions you might have.
There was kind of a second part to that Steve Durfee question about the need for a no-till coulter in the row up front.
And I'll just speak from my limited experience. We have a lot of people that do no-till on some acres. So after soybeans, no-tilling corn in. We do have a very few no-tillers that no-till every crop. And the comment from the folks that have been doing no-till for several years in a row in all of their crops is that that opening coulter they went with originally, and after 3 to 5 years, they didn't have a need for it anymore because of the mellowness of the soil. I'd like to hear Roy's comment on that because he probably works with a lot more people.
Yeah, so working with the row cleaners themselves, talking with both Martin and Yetter, they actually recommend getting rid of the no-till coulter completely. They say that the row cleaner up front with an air cylinder does just as good of a job. And that'll scratch the surface, remove the trash, any rocks that are in there that are loose, it can push them to the side. And it's not creating a wavy trench up front. You know, with that wavy coulter, there is a little bit of disturbance in the soil. And a lot of times they're fixed too, so they can't float. I've seen some out front in toolbar. So as you're going across rolling terrain, that really digs in and affects the seed trench.
So Roy, while we're on the subject of the sweeps in the front, most of the people that I see are doing, let's say, a corn soy rotation predominantly. They may or may not have cover crops. In fact, probably more often than not, there is no cover crops there. But if they started to plant more cover crops like a winter rye and then be coming in and planting soybeans the next year, what kind of recommendations would you make for those sweeps that might be different than the first situation where you're just doing corn soy?
So those ones, I think the air cylinder is going to make a big difference. You know, a lot of times guys previously where they didn't have the air cylinder, they had to go out and adjust each row individually. Mm-hmm. So the air cylinders allow you to adjust the rows from the cab all at once, and it allows you to put more pressure down, really engage them into the residue. You want those teeth catching the residue, cutting it up and throwing it. So you don't want it too deep. The other thing I would recommend is I've seen some guys do it with standing rye. They mat it down first with a roller, and that seems to help with the the row cleaners. And if you plant into too tall standing crop with the row cleaners, they will get tangled. The other thing to make sure is there's a scraper on the backside of the row cleaner. Make sure that's oriented correctly and right up against the knife. That helps with the trash, preventing trash from getting up in the row cleaner and binding up, I guess.
I know that there's, go ahead.
Jeff, I had the same kind of comments made by 2 farms I've worked with a bit up here in Northern New York who are completely 100% committed to the whole no-till approach. They haven't used any tillage on their farms in 15 years or so. They ended up removing all the stuff up front, the Coulters, the row cleaners and everything. And to one of the points that Roy just made about them being fixed and not floating is, I wonder if one of the contributing factors to that decision is that it's kind of spreading out the weight of the planter and spreading out the down pressure, which ends up not being helpful. Does that feed into it, that decision?
Yeah, I'd say that that's a factor into it. And a lot of guys too, if they don't have any cover crops, they may think that they don't need row cleaners. I've got a different opinion on that. I think there is definitely benefit for clearing crops, but scratching the soil surface and getting that soil temperature up there. So let's say if you're taking corn rows and next year you're doing corn on corn and you shift over 15 inches and you're planting in the row. If you have the row cleaners up front scratching that surface, then it'll help with opening and it'll help with closing too. There's more loose soil in that situation.
And so moving from the front of the planter to the back end of the planter, definitely the speaker, Dave Dumm, talked about the variety of closing wheels that are out there and closing systems. Now, it seems like there's a lot of movement towards a 2-stage closing system. Do you have any additional comments to what he talked about?
Yeah, I can agree. There's a lot of different planter attachments out there, and every single one of my customers has something different. So it depends on customer preference. A lot of times they see something on a forum and they try it and it works for them, and they don't necessarily try another option after that. I do know that with Precision Planting came out with their closing system. There's a couple other aftermarket brands that offer that 2-stage closing system. I know the case planters have had it for a while. So I do see more guys trying to go towards it. Yeah.
And so my experience looking at what especially grain producers are doing, they may have started with basically the original equipment, rubber wheels, and just like Dave suggested, they've tried individual row units, different systems to see which worked better for them in the very conditions that they farm in. And Oneida County has at least 200, if not more than 200 soil types that are mapped. So we really can change quite a little bit, even within a field. We definitely have our share of rocky ground as well. So what I've seen happen is a lot of these grain producers switched over to one smooth wheel and one spoked wheel. And I think that was basically stating, hey, it's a compromise that works okay in all of those conditions that they have to deal with. Any comments on that? And it's definitely okay if you don't have any comments on that. I do have a question, drag chain following the closing wheels versus, I'm seeing these systems where they just have a press wheel following it. Do you see any pluses or minuses for either one of those?
So typically the press wheels come in your two-stage closing. So like the speaker said, you're closing from the bottom up, and then that press wheel kind of packs it down from the top. So it closes the trench a little bit differently than your normal closing system. So I know the case planters have that press wheel. There's another brand out there, I think it's called Fast Track closing system that you can add to a John Deere or a Kinsey. But they're cupping the soil in and then lightly packing it from the top. The drag chains do it. Those are just trying to disrupt the dirt and close in the spikes, I guess.
Yeah, kind of fill in the cracks, right? That's the best
so
that they can do.
A little bit different in design, I believe. The other thing too, I know on Case's packing wheel, the angle of the ribs, so it's not smooth, it's actually got some ribs on there. They've incorporated that to allow the soil to flex a little bit and then allow water and nutrients into those cracks or imprints.
So gauge wheels, he talked a little bit about gauge wheels. I know that some companies are looking at, for lack of a better word, open gauge wheels, so allowing the soil to pass through the gauge wheel. And then there's definitely discussion on the slim, the 2.5 inch versus the 5 inch, and relation to compaction. And talking about urethane versus rubber. Do you have any comments on any of that?
So I haven't really gotten in too much into the gauge wheels.
Okay.
I know a lot of customers will, when they're rebuilding their planter, they don't put much thought into it. They just buy parts from Shoop or their dealer, whatever the OEM wheel is. But I have seen a couple guys do the spoked gauge wheels like you were talking about. I think that helps out in muddy conditions. It doesn't build up as much. Coming at it from the compaction side, I haven't seen any guys have that thought process yet.
And I read something recently, and this is dangerous because, not having the experience with it, but the suggestion that if you're going with rubber wheels, gauge wheels, that you buy them a year ahead with the idea that if they're allowed to sit for that amount of time, they harden and they actually wear better. Have you experienced that at all?
That's the first I'm hearing of it. That's an interesting
Interesting
point.
Could be misinformation, so please don't run out and buy a whole bunch of gauge wheels.
I would say you might buy them a year ahead of time for availability. I know parts are getting hard to come by now, but not heard of it for the rubber side of it.
Jeff, Aaron Gabriel makes a point in the chat box. He says we should distinguish between planting into corn silage and corn grain residues. And then he is wondering if the precision systems have adjustable seeding depth from the cab.
So Precision Planting has come out with a product called Smart Depth. It's, last I knew, it was in pre-production in the beta test phase. And basically what that does is it's an electric motor that's back at the closing wheels. So rather than the fork that you would typically, you twist and you rotate it up one notch or a dial or something, they've got an electric motor there. So they can change it, and they're tying that into their smart firmer. So sensing the soil moisture and then automatically adjusting the depth based on a certain moisture parameter. So it's out there, and in theory it makes sense. What they've found is the cost to add that to the planter versus the return on investment. It's kind of hard to justify. So I believe they were showing studies of 1 bushel to the acre yield increase, which isn't that much for what it costs to add that system to the planter.
Yeah, and that's a really practical question. If you said, okay, a farmer from this area has, I don't know, John Deere 7000 series, and not set up for no-till at the current time, what investments would you say you make first?
So the first thing would probably be the hydraulic downforce, because that adds more force than you can get with springs and airbags. It's also quicker to react than springs and airbags. So it's sensing the conditions as they change, and adjusting to them. So that'd be the first thing. And then I'd look at row cleaners with an air cylinder option. That kind of gets the soil loosened up front. If there are any rocks, sometimes I've seen them move rocks out of the way. So it helps get rid of rocks and debris up front. And then the other thing that I've seen guys start to add, and it's not available on all planters, but adding an air cylinder to the closing wheels. So I know Precision Planting came out with their complete system that has an airbag back there. But some of the older case planters running around just had a spring back there. And I've had a lot of guys add air cylinders, and they found that it helps with the closing of the trench, especially in no-till situations.
And if you said, okay, so first investment, down pressure, around what cost is it per row unit to add the down pressure, the hydraulic?
Oh, I don't remember off the top of my head. So I just did a system, but it was DOWNFORCE, electric drives, liquid product control, and a GPS display in the cab.
Yeah, okay. So
I don't remember off the top of my head, but
that's fair enough. I shouldn't expect you to be able to do that. I know that Dave Dunn made some comments as far as some of those investments, and I'm just trying to think back whether it was down pressure that was one of those items, and that it's 500 acres in 3 years, over those 500 acres where you pay it back.
That was clutches he was talking about.
Yes, you're right.
Yep.
Yeah. So it is one of those things, and I've seen some studies, and we could show a couple of studies from Beck's, and unfortunately, first, it's Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, states like that where they're doing their research, and their soils are definitely different than ours. But long story short, when you look at the trials that they do, and I give them a lot of credit for doing it because they do it at multiple locations, multi-state studies, but they compare something like no sweeps to floating sweeps to down pressure at 25 pounds, and they show how many bushels you gain by making those changes. And it is, like you were saying before, like fractions of a bushel increase from going from no row cleaners to row cleaners that float, and then even less going from floating row cleaners to ones that have some pressure behind them. And I look at the study and say, well, okay, so is that really going to be true for growers here? Just like Steve's question, how does it work on rocky ground, that kind of thing. But there is information out there if you want to look at some of those comparisons and comparisons of different vendors and different products. And we hope to collect some of those links for you and send them out after this meeting, so you can start to do some of your own investigations. I think Dave's comment of saying, hey, try a row unit or two, or maybe a couple, to first take a look at the technology and then move on from there. I'm not sure that that's something that you can do with down pressure very easily. But Roy, going from that air system to the hydraulic, I understand that the air system is really going to be, I don't know, wings or at least parts of the planter. And to really test what kind of pressure you have on each row unit, you probably have to have a scale like a milk scale or something like that that can give you a reading on each one of those rows to see what the actual impact is and what adjustments can be made in between. It makes sense in this area with as much change in soils as we have in individual fields that the payback would be quicker here than it would be in the Midwest with, you know, having the same soil type, you know, running a mile. So I could see where it would pay back more quickly here. And like you said, the clutches, you know, again, thank you for the reminder. You know, here he's doing some of these studies in Pennsylvania where you have odd shaped fields and small fields, and that's what a lot of the growers in this area have to deal with. And you can see where some of those investments might pay back more quickly under those conditions.
Yeah, I actually did a with one of my customers in Holland Patton. With their fields, I put it through a calculator, and I told it it was offered through CNH. And you can select which direction you farm that field, how many rows, and then you currently have, and then what you're looking at going to. And their fields are so odd shaped at 2,200 acres. If they planted all their land into corn, they would save about $40,000 of seed.
Wow. That helps pay back the investment quick, huh?
Yeah.
So Kitty, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to thank Roy for his explanations, and you know, he and the gentleman in the video and the guys I've talked to and you and Aaron and Janice and everyone emphasizes every time we talk about this how it's important to tweak your planter for your conditions and your cropping rotation and your habits and stuff. And so I think that is really a valuable point. Everybody agrees. No one agrees on every little tidbit that you need on the planter, but everyone agrees that you need to figure out what works for you. And then there are some broad generalizations about, you know, focusing on down pressure and row opening and row closing. And there's some constants, but the biggest constant is to try things, maybe one row or two rows at a time, and to make something work for you. It matters what residues you're going into, what your soil types are, whether you plant early or plant late into cold or wet or dry, etc. That's all.
That's a really good point. And Dave commented on the fact that, yeah, it's go time in the spring, and yes, we have some small windows for planting at times, but how valuable that time is getting out of the tractor, off, you know, the planter, and actually getting the spade out and digging and finding out what's going on behind that planter. So very good points, Kitty. So with that, I'm going to ask Janice if she can post the CCA credits for those people who are certified crop advisors. And we can still entertain any questions.
I need to look for that, Jeff. I just want to give Roy a minute. We kind of threw him into the answering. Did you get to introduce yourself and say where you're located in the state, Roy? Maybe just tell people how they maybe could get a hold of you if they had more questions down the road.
Yeah, I apologize. I was working with a customer before the meeting. So my name's Roy Garrett. I'm a precision product specialist with Monroe Tractor. I'm actually out of the Adams Center store. So I went to college at Coulters a couple years ago, and then did an internship with Monroe, and they took me on full time. So within Monroe, there are several other guys that make up our precision team. So we've got Seth Conway in Batavia, John Ryder out of our Canandaigua store, Nathan Wood out of Auburn, and then we've got Nick Moore out of our Latham store. And that's all we do is precision products, whether it's auto steer, planting, spraying, tile plows, yield maps. So we like looking at the situation, figuring out what the customer's end goal is, and then looking at all the different brands and resources we have available to us and finding the best solution. So we've got pretty much anything out there we can get our hands on besides John Deere precision stuff. So I can throw my contact information in the chat, but regionally, there are other guys that might be able to, might be more local. I can actually throw in a link to everybody's information.
Thank you so much, Roy.